Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now we used the RX 460 the other day in the Xbox One versus PC video where we tested a handful of games. Today I wanted to expand on that by testing this 4GB Sapphire Nitro RX 460 with more titles using a better CPU. How well does this card hold up in 2021? This GPU, like most others, hasn't escaped inflated pricing, but you can still find these at a reasonable cost. I got this one for under £100 from CEX in the UK, and I didn't know which version I'd be getting until it turned up because of the stock photos that they use. I was pretty pleased to see the Nitro edition sitting inside the box, which looks quite nice and performs fairly quietly even under load. The 460 comes in 2 and 4GB variants, and I'd certainly recommend the 4GB model, but your budget and availability will play a big part in which one you buy. Let's get straight into the games then. We'll start with one of the newest releases tested today and one of the most demanding. I tried to stick to 1080p where 30fps or above was still possible, at least in third person perspective titles. AC Valhalla looks decent even on low, and will run at 1920 by 1080 using the on-screen settings with an average of 37fps. As I said in my Xbox One versus PC video, this card is probably the minimum I'd suggest for matching a modern day Xbox One experience. In that video we used a lower dynamic res, but in this one I'm showing you that 30fps can still be achieved at a higher resolution with a better processor. There will be a few dips here and there, particularly in towns, but if like me most of your time is going to be spent running around the snowy landscapes of Norway or the beautiful English countryside, then the frame rate will probably sit between 35 and 40. Here are the settings I used for Battlefield 5. 1080p medium seemed like a sensible middle ground, though the game didn't do as well as I thought it would. I've got to be honest, because I tend to test more Nvidia cards, I can sort of gauge how every card I test is going to perform, but with AMD it's always a surprise. But usually only because I benchmark more Team Green GPUs, not because of personal preference, but because here they seem to be more widely available at lower prices on the used market. Regarding the 460's performance though, and you'd be better off with a lower resolution for a closer to 60fps experience, but the game is certainly playable at full HD. I wouldn't go higher than medium settings though. In Call of Duty Cold War, medium combined with a few low settings will mean a decent experience at 1080p with the average frame rate sitting between 50 and 60. Different story missions and different multiplayer maps will all have various effects on performance metrics, so it's up to you which settings you go for. As always, this footage was from a bot match, but the figures were taken from an online game, which to be honest won't really perform any differently. The 460 is still doing alright, even at 1080p. Now in Cyberpunk we needed to drop the resolution scaling to 80% in the settings if we wanted to hit 30fps on average, though there were still some drops to the mid-20s. This is inevitable with a lot of cards, to be fair. I'm going to say that I'd probably prefer to play it like this with the 460 than I would to play it on the base Xbox One and PS4 consoles, because while it may differ visually, the performance we're getting here I feel is more consistent even with the frame rate dips included. This is all subject to change of course as the game continues to receive updates. Who knows, it might run at 60fps this time next year with something like a 460. We can only hope. Now with Fortnite I'd recommend medium. High settings are also playable, but there will be a few more dips here and there. Medium sort of accounts for that. The average FPS was 91, which is decent enough, but the medium preset means that we're prepared for any sudden dips, which shouldn't impact the frame rate too much with these settings. I always try and achieve a nice balance between visual quality and performance, so I think I've done that here, although anyone looking to hit over 100fps can either opt for low settings or select the performance mode API, which will make the graphics look pretty, well, bad, but it will give you a huge performance boost and likely double the FPS or more with a card like this. It goes without saying that GTA 5 isn't really a hard game to run these days. We opted for the highest settings, keeping all those advanced options like MSAA off for the sake of a plus 60 FPS figure. Even as I ran around downtown causing carnage, our frame rate stayed pretty smooth, so venturing into the countryside will yield even better performance from this configuration. We're testing with an i5-10400F, but honestly this card will be fine with a much weaker CPU. Something like an i3 or Ryzen 3 will be absolutely fine, or maybe even an old school i7-2600 or something like that, and you should see similar performance in GPU intensive games. Still, it doesn't hurt to have 6 cores and 12 threads at your disposal for those CPU intensive scenarios. Low or medium settings is fine for the Outer Worlds. This didn't do as well as I thought it might do, but I believe it still runs worse on AMD GPUs than Nvidia ones, even after many updates. What I mean by that is that, let's say you have one of these and you also have what is considered the Nvidia equivalent, probably a 950 or something like that. The game will run better on that Nvidia equivalent than it will on this card. The experience is still okay. I've said it before, but the art style of this game means that it looks good even on low, and the difference between this and the higher presets won't be all too noticeable. With Overwatch, I went straight in at the high preset with 100% res scale. There were no problems maintaining over 100 FPS on average here, and the percentile figures were also pretty solid, judging by those 1.1% lows. Overwatch is still very relevant in my opinion, so I've thrown it back into the benchmark selection, and it's quite forgiving on lower end hardware. It's another one of those whereby it doesn't really matter if you choose low or high settings, because visually things don't look too different unless you're studying the two presets side by side in a screenshot or something. Now with Red Dead Redemption 2, I decided on the Xbox One equivalent settings as provided by Digital Foundry. The only exception to this is of course the resolution, because we're running it at 1920 by 1080, but even so it looks fantastic and runs pretty well too. We tested this one in our Xbox versus PC comparison the other day and found that it ran quite similar then as well, likely because it's more GPU intensive. Give this game 4 or more cores and it will be happy. I don't think 60 FPS is worth the significant visual sacrifice we'd have to make, just like with most of the other games I've tested, but it's all down to personal preference. That's just part of the beauty of PC gaming, of course. Watch Dogs Legion next, and I chose the medium preset, but I switched a couple of options off, including motion blur and depth of field, just due to personal preference. I was quite surprised by the performance here, to be fair. I didn't expect to see a 30 plus FPS at Full HD, and I was certain we'd need to make a few changes to the other settings, perhaps even lowering the resolution. The 460, it seems then, well, is doing okay. So The Witcher 3 at high with medium post-processing options and a couple of personal tweaks, including motion blur and sharpness all switched off, ran okay as well. Novigrad is often considered one of the most demanding areas in this game, but even so the frame rate held up quite well, even with these decent looking visuals. There were many settings to mess around with, or there are many settings to mess around with I should say, and you can certainly do a lot more intricate tweaking with this game, and of course you'll get more frames by doing so, but it's nice to know that you can just slap everything on high at the click of a button and still hit 30 plus FPS. Not bad. I just wish the graphics card price actually reflected its performance, like every card right now I suppose. Finally then, it's Crysis Remastered, which recently received a 6GB performance update adding things like DLSS for RTX cards. We don't care about that, so we'll just be talking about the performance on this card, of course. You'll be pleased to know that the game runs fine with around 45 FPS at the low preset, which in this game looks good regardless. It seems that the 460 is still holding up just fine, and is still an okay 1080p 30 FPS choice in 2021, though there will, I'm sure, be a few select games that will cause dips below that figure, even with reduced settings. All that needs to happen now is prices get back to normal, if that's ever going to be the case. From what I've seen, prices at the lower end are stabilising a little bit, so who knows, maybe over the next few months the hardware market, new and used, will calm down. But we can only hope. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't. Thank you very much for watching, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, let me know your thoughts on the 460 down below, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.